Okay, guys, so just wanted to use this opportunity to thank everyone for coming here, and thank you very much to Wireless LAN Pros for getting this conference together. Unfortunately, this is the last session of the day, or of 3 days, and we are all extremely happy to be in Prague again, I guess. It's been 3 years, and we love Prague. Looking forward already to coming back here next year.
Yeah, super excited. And when we was getting prepared for this presentation, Mac had a 6 gigahertz access point, I had some 6 gigahertz clients, and we don't really, even though you see us all together all the time, but we don't actually see each other in person very often. So our plan is that we'll come to WLPC and we'll collect some data that we can put into our presentation that we can start to use. So if anyone saw us last night frantically working on our laptops by the reception, that was us putting the slides together. And then we came down this morning, and David Coleman, fantastic presentation.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, and I watched it and I went, oh crap, that has got a lot of the content that we was going to talk about. So went straight back upstairs and started editing the slides again. So very quick introduction for anyone that doesn't know who we are. We are working at Ekahau as product marketing and heading up BCSE. So very excited to be here talking to you today, and we're going to be talking about 6 gigahertz and how cool is 6 gigahertz. I mean, even just sitting here, being in the sessions, we're learning more and more about 6 gigahertz. So we're going to be specifically talking about that. We have our Sidekick 2 with us. We're going to be giving that away at the end of our session today as well. So if you're not familiar with the Sidekick 2, it's our latest hardware that we've brought out that supports all 3 frequency bands for 2.4, 5, and 6 gigahertz. So you can do your validation, your troubleshooting, all using the Sidekick 2. I think speaking to most people in the room, the thing that everyone was the most excited about was the USB-C connectivity. So yeah, funny when the small little things that add up. So yeah, it's amazing. It's a really cool device. But one of the questions that we was getting, especially around 6 gigahertz, was, oh my gosh, there's so many more channels that we have to scan now. So how are we going to do this? It's going to take so long, right? I mean, are we going to have to go back to the stop and go surveys? Anyone like doing stop and go surveys?
No. So just a fun fact, guys, stop and go survey is the most popular survey mode used in the wild.
So yeah, well, that was a question that we had, and good news is that we don't have to go back to stop and go surveys, because actually the Sidekick 2 captures more data points. So it goes around all 3 frequency bands and collects that data yet faster than the original Sidekick captured on 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. So don't worry, not going back to the days of stop and go, continuous, autopilot. Yeah, you can carry on doing your favorite types of surveys.
Now, let's talk about new versus old. So obviously, 6 gigahertz doesn't cover as much as 5 gigahertz, right? So is 6 gigahertz really cooler? What's different? Is it faster? So first, David has already talked about it, so let's not dwell on that slide for too long. Free space path loss together with our rule of every time you double the distance, you quarter the power, meaning that we are getting next 6 dBs, and that's for all bands, right? But initially, over the first meter, we are losing around 2 dBs more on 6 gigs versus 5 gigs, for example. And is that really true? And the answer is, if you're looking at the central frequency of both bands, 5 and 6, in a perfect lab environment, with an antenna that has exactly the same coverage pattern, then it is true. But here, you can see that we have just like 1 dBm difference, 51 versus 52. So it's 1 dB difference. And why is that the case? What should we expect in the real world? Is 6 gigs really that lower when it comes to coverage than 5? And the answer is, it's not. It's the difference. Sometimes will be 0 dBm, sometimes it will be 3, and it's normal. That depends on the coverage pattern inside the antennas. That's the one. So you can check the antennas pattern from each vendor, and depending on what side of the access point you stand on, how is it mounted, you will see different RSSI, and it's absolutely normal. The conclusion is that 6 gigahertz coverage is not massively different to 5 gigahertz coverage, but wait, what we've seen is for 20 megahertz. How about if you start bonding channels? Because bonding channels in 6 gigahertz will probably be default, right? So Matt, how does that work?
Yeah, so prior to 6 gigahertz and 6E, every time you double the channel, you double the amount of noise that you bring into the channel. Therefore, you're going to be having that payoff of a decrease in your signal to noise ratio. But whereas with Wi-Fi 6E, 11AX and 6 gigahertz, every time you double the channel width, we are offsetting that by increasing our EIRP, so we can maintain that high signal to noise ratio and therefore MCS rates. That's why signal to noise ratio is important, because we want to have the higher MCS rates, we want to be able to go faster, transfer our data faster, and maintain the higher MCS by keeping our signal to noise ratio high. And by doing that, we're going to be able to achieve that 1024 QAM. So MCS 10 or MCS 11, if you're not familiar with this table, this is just a very small subset of what you can actually see. But we were just focusing on that here because we heard some stories actually that you need to be sat right on top of the access point to be able to maintain 1024 QAM, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
But this is not really the case, guys. Like, based on our recent test with different devices across all 3 bands, you really don't have to be that close to the access points. And the question is, what is the typical distance between the access point in your typical medium, high-ish density, open plan, carpeted office space? Is it the right assumption when we say that you won't want to have more APs than like every 10-ish meters, maybe every 12 meters makes more sense, not more than 15 meters, but what does that mean in a real practical world? If you are having APs every 12-ish meters, you won't have any clients being farther away from the access point than 8.5 meters. And that translates to around MCS 11. And if you exceed the distance of around 8.5 meters, you will drop down to MCS 10. And that's the real world. So it's not very easy, but it's fairly easy to achieve and maintain 1024 QAM everywhere, even on 6 gigahertz. So now, since we are talking about 6 gigahertz and maintaining it, how do we see 6 gigahertz? How do we discover it? Let's spend a second or 10 talking just about that. So before we talk about 6 gigahertz, let's talk about 2.4 and 5. So there we had 2 discovery methods, in-band, all of them, and one was passive, beacons, waiting for them, dwelling on the channel, and one was active, probe requests, probe responses, a little bit faster, but not on DFS channels, you can't probe there. So how do we want to discover 6 gigs? One of the methods that we thought it's not going to be used is FILS, a fast initial link setup, which is a very condensed beacon, and it's being sent every 20 milliseconds when compared to a beacon that is being sent every 102.4 milliseconds typically. So why do we want to send more beacons? It's because we have up to 59 channels now in 6 gigs. So if we are relying on in-band discovery, it might make sense to dwell on the channel for a shorter time, so we don't have to dwell on every channel to discover it for 105 milliseconds or more in order to discover it anymore. But what's the drawback of using FILS? FILS, even beacons that are being sent like every 100-ish microseconds, they contribute to a lot of management overhead, right? So if we are putting in the air FILS every 20 milliseconds, that's too much overhead. So no one will use FILS, right? As it's too much overhead. But in reality, we were testing 6 gigs from multiple vendors. We've tested Cisco, we've tested Cambium, we've tested Ruckus. And all of them, they use FILS by default. So everything blue is beacons, everything yellowish, orangey is FILS. And it's a lot of overhead. We've had a chat actually with Jiri from Cisco, and if you have Catalyst APs, not Meraki, because that's what we've captured was from Meraki, you actually don't have FILS enabled by default. You can, but you don't have to. So every vendor will approach it differently. And the bottom line is, check the default behavior of your vendor. You might not need a FILS in your network for your devices to discover it. So just be mindful of it, that it adds overhead. And how much overhead does it add, man?
Well, here we go. You can see a beacon frame where it's got all of that information where being advertised from the access point. And then we see a shot of the fields where it's just the basic stuff. So just really trying to give you that essential information that you would need to be able to associate. So your SSID, BSSID, and channel. So yeah. But we took a look at the into the QBSS channel utilization. All we've got here is a single SSID being broadcasted with an access point that's got no clients connected, no interference, and we're seeing channel utilization of 5% with nobody connected. No channel interference, nothing at all. So what can we do to reduce that overhead? So another thing to think about here is that beacons, they're being broadcasted around 10 times per second per SSID each radio. Well, Another thing for this in-band discovery that's kind of new for 6 gigahertz here is the multiple BSID beacon frames that's going to contain, basically, if you have more SSIDs configured on your 6 gigahertz radios, rather than them all being sent out individually, they're condensed into one frame. So that is going to help with reducing some overhead. So we've got a capture here of showing you one of the 6 gigahertz radios that had this enabled, where it's got multiple SSIDs and it's all being sent out inside of the same frame.
Of course. So then you think, if you don't want to use fields to reduce your management overhead, what can you really use? And the answer to this is that default by most vendors will be the PSC. And PSC, it means that we will have 80 megahertz bonded channels, with every second channel on every 80 megahertz bonded channel being the primary channel on that white channel. And it makes sense, right? But only in states, because in states we have 1.2 gig and it translates to how many? Like 15 80 megahertz channels available. Is it possible, you think, to have like a contention-free-ish network in a typical environment with 15 channels being used? How difficult is it to get CCI to none in multi-tenant, multi-story buildings, even on 5 gigahertz, where we have around 25 channels available, right? So we will have to try to answer the question and find the right balance in channel width versus the contention that it adds. So even in states, if you have 15 channels, my gut feeling is, and we don't know it because there is not too many 6 gigahertz networks around yet, that we will suffer from quite a lot of contention, even with 80 megahertz and even with additional 1.2 gig of spectrum. So that was the US. Default behavior will be a PSC discovery method. But would that really work in Europe or in the EU plus the UK, because it's not a part of Europe anymore, is it? Yeah, so now we have 6 channels, 80 megahertz channels, and with 6 channels, it's not too many, is it? With 6 channels, we will have tons of contention. And really, by bonding channels to 80 megahertz, we will, of course, have higher data rates, but would these higher data rates still be enough to really offset the negative impact of the CCI? And the reality is, we no longer have to support legacy clients on 6 gigs, right? So it's easy peasy lemon squeezy, but how about the PHY headers and the preambles and all the management and control traffic? It's still using super low data rates. So that combined with high contention, with high CCI, will contribute to tons of airtime utilization, and we have to be super mindful of that. So let me ask you this question. What channel widths would you use on 6 gigahertz?
In the EU, here, hands up if you think 20s. What if you was doing just like 20s? 20s?
20s?
Yeah, okay.
40.
40s next, 40s?
Do we have?
40s,
Okay.
quite popular, okay. Anyone for 80s?
320.
320.
Woo! One channel in 6 gigahertz, okay. Anyone for the 160s and 6 gig in EU? Just for clarification, no one. Okay, so 20s were quite popular. 40s was the most popular, and then there was a couple people with 80s in the EU. So if we're not going to be leveraging 80 megahertz channels in the EU, that means that we are really probably going to have to rely on a different method to discover our 6 gigahertz radios. And this is the first time we've got this out-of-band discovery. So for us to see this for the first time and get our heads around it and get used to it is, it's great to learn these things again. So reduced neighbor report, David spoke about in depth earlier, but basically you can have a access point that's got multiple radios, 2.45, 6 gigahertz, and then the access points radios, 2.45 gigahertz, can actually inform the client device about its 6 gigahertz radio. So even if you're capturing on 5 gigahertz, your client device will get a reduced neighbor report from the access point, which will tell it about its co-located radio, which is pretty cool, I think. So that's the reduced neighbor report. But we have questions, like we're not sure, okay, so we've got this new reduced neighbor report, but do we have to have the same SSID configured across all 3 bands? Because I know it's been spoken about a lot already during WLPC, because when you think about security and WPA3 and client connectivity support, having the same SSID across all 3 bands could be problematic from that perspective. But The good news is that we don't have to have the same SSID across all 3 bands. So what we've got here is the Cambium AP in the ECSE Troubleshooting Bootcamp class. We captured the frames, and we can see we're looking right now at a reduced neighbor report on channel 36 on 5 gigahertz from the Cambium AP. And let me just zoom in a little bit. And this is when we get the information now about the access points co-located 6 gigahertz radio. So we can see the channel that it's on, and then take a look there, same SSID, false. So I think, everyone in here is amazing at designing Wi-Fi networks after you've been here for a few days. And one of the big things you take away from it is, we don't want to have the same SSID typically configured across all 3 bands, because we want to keep our clients connected on the frequency that we want them to be on. And the only way you can really guarantee it is by having a single band SSID. So this is really cool.
Okay, but the reality is, guys, even if we don't have too much of a new spectrum in the EU and the UK, most of the vendors' default configuration will be 80 megahertz channels. So we will have the 6 channels, right? So even if you want to do the right thing, and even if you want to stick to 20 or 40 megahertz channels, you will do the right thing, but your neighbors, they might not be too inclined to change the defaults that they don't understand. And that's very important for us to not only educate ourselves, but also to educate people around us. So if you have neighbors in Europe that are sticking to 80 megahertz channels, and if that affects your network, we'll be talking about how it affects your network, buy them a coffee and tell them it's a bad idea, so you don't have to talk over each other. So what we see here is a perfect situation, right, where we have like bonded channel. We will have 80 megahertz bonded channels, right? But they are non-overlapping at all. And on the next slide, and also David has told us quite a lot about that earlier today, we have overlapping on the same bonded channel, but our primary channels are no longer overlapping. And that creates a primary-secondary or BSS issue, where in most cases, and I say in most cases because it's not true for all the cases, when one client is transmitting on channel 38, primary 36, for example, when the other client wants to transmit also on channel 38 with a primary channel of being 40 now, they do not overlap on primary channels, and they will be talking all over each other, contributing massively to retransmissions. And we really, really don't want that, right?
No. So surely this isn't going to be a problem for us in 6 gigahertz, but we just had a great conversation with Keith in the class, in the troubleshooting class, and of course this can happen to us in 6 gigahertz as well. So here is a screenshot of Ekahau AI Pro and a survey that was done with the Sidekick 2. And what we've got here is we've got some 6 gigahertz access points. And actually, I'm not sure if anyone got the update yesterday, but look, the green AP icon colors are back. Hey. So the green AP colored icons, there's the Aruba access points we had set up for doing some testing. And then they had purchased some consumer grade devices. So there's a lot of like Netgear devices in there. So all the ones that are in the color of pink, they are the Netgear ones, but they're using 80 megahertz wide channels on 6 gigahertz. And then the red ones, these are the Netgear consumer grade devices, but actually they are using 160 megahertz wide channels. So if I just zoom in on it here, you can see 69, 160, and then down here, 85 at 160. If we take a look at it in this view, where we look at the radios in a couple of different ways. So we see the list on the left-hand side, but then on the right-hand side, we can see the 6 gigahertz spectrum, and we've highlighted the two 160 megahertz wide channels, and then the other access points that were using 80 megahertz wide channels. And we know that when it comes to 80 megahertz wide channels and 160 in 6 gigahertz, probably not going to be too much problem for this primary secondary overlap in BSS, because the primary channels are in sync. But this is going to be contributing to channel contention. But what if the majority of the room put your hands up and said, I'm going to do 20s or 40 megahertz wide channels? Well, what's going to happen in this situation when we start to do that? And you've got all of these other vendors around you using these channels, either 80s or 160. So it's just something else that we have to think about and then plan for. And if coffee doesn't work, we've heard pizza is a good way to speak to your neighbors and to get them to reconfigure their networks as well.
Okay, so we just wanted to show you some spectrum on 6 gigahertz we were testing 6 gigs with our Sidekick 2, with different vendors' APs and doing captures on top of that. Oh, that's very helpful, isn't it?
Perfect timing, eh?
And inside the spectrum, we wanted to draw your attention to the primary channel. Where do you see the primary channel there? So on the left-hand side, we have like 20 megahertz. So this is like used for both as a primary channel and data transmission. But Matt, talk us through what you see on the 80 megahertz bonded channels there, man.
Yeah, so we had those 2 different client devices connected, and first we was running some speed tests on the channel 5, which was the 20 megahertz wide channel, and you can see that activity. But if you take a look at the 80 megahertz wide channel, you can see that the majority of the activity was happening on that second bonded 20 megahertz channel inside that 80 for around the channel 53 there, because that's where the management and the control frames are going. So we just zoomed in a little bit and we did it again. You can see that really high resolution bandwidth spectrum, and most of the traffic being sent on that second 20 megahertz wide channel. So for us, we like playing around with the tools and seeing this. We find it very fascinating to see, and getting some 6 gigahertz clients connected to the access point and capturing it with the Sidekick. And I'm going to try.
I'm quite surprised you didn't call the spectrum sexy yet, man. So guys, even if you have an option to change your primary channel from a second channel bonded channel to something else, don't. Stick to the second one to avoid OBSS.
And I'm just going to try and reconnect to the Wi-Fi here, because it's been very good all week, hasn't it? I need to sign in. I won't show you all my username and password. Yeah.
Screenshot time.
Yeah. Maybe next time we won't use Google Slides live connected to the internet, where it requires connectivity. What could go wrong, hey?
Okay, so guys, while Matthew is regaining the control, let's talk about some of our product updates very quickly to just paint the picture of what you can achieve and what you can do with the tools that are not yet available fully, but will be very shortly. So first, let's start with Ekahau Analyzer app. And this is, my friends, the coolest thing we've seen out of Ekahau in the last several weeks. Why do I think it's cool? You will have an expert view. It's called the network overview, but really it's an expert view where you will be able to peek into way more fields, columns, details when compared to what you can see now. So you will be able to see the security, logical and physical channel utilization with your Sidekick connected to it. You will be able to see pretty much all the common fields that you would expect from a top quality WLAN scanner. And then you can use that tool to go to the site, just power up a Sidekick, connect it to any device of your choice, and very quickly see at a very quick glance what's happening with your network. Do you have old school security enabled? Does it limit the number of spatial streams and rates that you can use? Do you have to stick to 54 megs? What is the logical versus physical channel utilization? How does your access point see the network? How many stations you have connected to each radio? We haven't seen it before, and now we can, you will be able very shortly, and that's how it would look like, but you can fully customize the columns and see whatever is relevant to you.
Exactly, and this is just a screenshot from the iPad. You can, like Max said, completely customize it. Maybe there's certain things you want to look at different scenarios and take a look at. The cool thing here is that the ability now to be able to just troubleshoot a Wi-Fi network by putting out your iPad connected to your Sidekick, seeing how the network is configured, how many stations you've got connected, all directly from your iPad is going to be a game changer to be able to troubleshoot Wi-Fi networks again. Just using this is really, really exciting. But another thing that's coming out very, very soon, Ekahau is releasing a private cellular planning tool. So this is something else that we've been working on, and it's going to be coming out very, very soon. And also it's going to be free. So we are giving away 12 months free access to the private cellular tool for anyone who has got a Ekahau Connect subscription, or if anyone that purchases an Ekahau Connect subscription before the end of the year will get access to this tool for free. So that's pretty much the end of our presentation, but there's one more thing that we've got left now, and it's to give away a Sidekick 2. So thank you to everyone that registered, and now I'm going to go through the list, and hopefully the people are in the room. So the first name,
Yes,
of course. So everyone that registered, it all went into a spreadsheet and then had a random number generated, and I've been sent the list now of the people that have won. So we already gave away one at our evening session on Wednesday to Bill. Congratulations. Yeah. So the first person on the list is Jean-Marc Dankaratz. Hey.
Woo!
Go.
Congratulations,
Get a
man.
picture. Okay. And
Congrats.
thank you guys. That's all our presentation. So thank you very much.
Thanks.